The land around Stone Creek didn't forgive. It was a hard country of cracked earth and rock, where the sun was a merciless hammer for 5 months of the year, beating the landscape into submission. The wind was a constant, mournful whisper that scoured the plains, picking up dust fine as flour and carrying it for miles, dusting the sills of every window and settling in the creases of every face. It was a place that demanded grit, a place that stripped a person down to their barest essentials: will, water, and work. Summer had clamped down on the territory with a suffocating heat. The heat shimmered in waves above the rocky hills that cupped the small, dusty town, making the distant shapes of Eli's cattle seem to wobble and melt. Stone Creek itself was little more than a single street of sun-bleached wooden storefronts, a general store, a saloon whose bat-wing doors swung listlessly, a blacksmith's shop that rang with a slow, reluctant rhythm, and a white church whose steeple seemed to poke a hole in the vast, unforgiving blue of the sky. The people here were like the land, weathered, quiet, and tough. They spoke little because there was little to say that the wind and the sun hadn't already said for them. It was in this world that Clara lived, or rather, existed. She moved through her days like a phantom, a pale wisp of a woman against the harsh, sun-drenched backdrop. A year ago, she had been Mrs. Abernathy, wife to a prospector with a feverish look in his eye and hands that were too quick. Then, Mr. Abernathy had been found at the bottom of a ravine, his horse gone and his neck broken. The sheriff called it a tragic accident, a misstep on a treacherous trail. The townsfolk whispered other things, of gambling debts and a temper that could curdle milk, but whispers were as common as dust in Stone Creek, and just as hard to grasp. What was certain was that Clara was left a widow, with nothing but a small, heavily mortgaged house and the pitying glances of her neighbors. Loneliness and poverty were a slow, grinding death in a place like this. So when Eli Vance, a rancher known for his steady hands and unwavering moral compass, came calling, it was seen as an act of providence. Eli was a good man, a pillar of the small community. His ranch was prosperous, his fences well-mended, his word as solid as the granite hills. He was also alone. His parents had passed years ago, leaving him with a sprawling property and a house that had grown too quiet. He was a man of routine and order, and his life lacked the gentle touch that made a house a home. Their courtship was a stark, practical affair, devoid of poetry or passion. It was an arrangement, a silent contract understood by two lonely people. Eli drove his wagon to her small house one Sunday after church. He stood on her porch, hat in hand, his face earnest and sunburned. "Mrs. Abernathy," he'd said, his voice low and direct. "I have a good ranch and a solid home. It's clean and it's sturdy, but it's an empty place. I'm in need of a wife to keep it, to put a hot meal on the table. I can offer you security, a respectable name, and my protection. I will treat you with respect." Clara had looked at him, her gray eyes holding a depth of sorrow he couldn't begin to fathom. She saw not a suitor, but an escape from the hunger that gnawed at her belly, from the whispers that followed her down the street, from the crushing weight of a past she desperately wanted to bury. "I can do that, Mr. Vance," she had replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can keep a good house." And so, Clara Abernathy became Clara Vance. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. The widow was cared for, and the good rancher would no longer eat his suppers alone. It was a sensible match. They were married by the circuit preacher on a Tuesday. The ceremony was brief, held in the small living room of Eli's ranch house with two of his ranch hands as witnesses. Afterward, Clara quietly moved her few belongings from her old house into his. She was given the master bedroom, the one that had belonged to Eli's mother. Eli, without a word, moved his own things into the smaller guest room across the hall. It was a gesture of respect, a demarcation of the line that existed between them. Their life together fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. Eli would rise before dawn. The smell of his coffee, the first sound in the house. By the time he came in from his early chores, Clara would have breakfast on the table, biscuits, bacon, eggs. They ate in a comfortable, if profound, silence. He would nod his thanks, put on his hat, and head out to the vast expanse of his land, a solitary figure disappearing into the heat. Clara would spend her day transforming the house. She cleaned with a quiet ferocity, aired out dusty rooms, mended his work shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and cooked meals that were hearty and dependable. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sky bleed from orange to purple over the distant hills. Sometimes Eli would talk about the cattle, about the lack of rain, about a fence that needed mending. Clara would listen, her hands folded in her lap, offering a quiet, "Is that so?" or a simple nod. She never spoke of her life before him, of her first husband, of the family she must have had somewhere. Her past was a locked chest, and she gave no indication of where the key might be. Eli, in turn, respected her silence. He saw the guardedness in her eyes, the way she would sometimes flinch if he moved too quickly or spoke too suddenly. He saw her as a woman who had been wounded by life, a delicate bird with a broken wing that he had taken into his care. It was his duty to provide a safe perch, not to probe the old injuries. He found himself admiring her resilience, her quiet dignity. He appreciated the order she brought to his home, the smell of baking bread that now filled the kitchen, the clean sheets on his bed. It was more than he'd had, and he was grateful. But it wasn't love. It was an agreement, honorably upheld. For Clara, the ranch was a sanctuary. The endless work was a blessing, a way to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering down dark, familiar paths. Eli's quiet presence was a comfort. He was a good man, a predictable man. He demanded nothing of her but the tasks she had agreed to, and for that, she felt a deep, quiet gratitude. But she held herself apart, a visitor in her own life, afraid that if she let anyone get too close, the ghosts she kept locked away might spill out and ruin this fragile peace. They lived together, two solitary figures sharing a roof, their lives running in parallel lines that never truly touched. Then came the night that changed everything. The heat had refused to break even after sundown. The air in the house was thick and still, heavy with the scent of dried grass and dust. Eli lay awake in his narrow bed, listening to the chirr of crickets outside the open window. A sliver of moon cast a pale, milky light across the wooden floor. He'd been dreaming of drought, of cracked earth and cattle with their ribs showing, a common anxiety for a man of the land. He swung his legs out of bed, his throat parched. A glass of water from the kitchen pump would settle him. He moved silently through the hallway, his bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. As he passed Clara's room, he paused. The door was slightly ajar to let in any hint of a breeze. In the moonlight filtering through her window, he could see her form under the thin white sheet. He had never watched her sleep before. It felt like an intrusion, a violation of the unspoken boundaries that governed their lives. Yet, he couldn't pull his eyes away. In sleep, the guardedness fell from her face. The tight set of her jaw was gone. Her brow was smooth. She looked younger, more vulnerable. For the first time, she didn't look like the widow Abernathy or Mrs. Vance, the keeper of his home. She just looked like Clara. A strange, protective tenderness bloomed in his chest, an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude or duty. It was a flicker of something more, something he hadn't allowed himself to even consider. He thought, perhaps, that this was how a real marriage might begin, not with a contract, but with quiet moments like this. He was about to turn away when she stirred. She sighed softly, a sound of deep, troubled slumber. And then she spoke. Her voice was a murmur, a thread of sound so faint he almost missed it. It was thick with sleep, a whisper from the deepest part of her soul. Samuel. The name hung in the silent air of the hallway, alien and sharp. It wasn't his name. It wasn't a name he had ever heard her speak. It was the name of a stranger. Eli froze, the breath caught in his throat. The floorboards beneath his feet suddenly felt ice cold. He stood there, a statue in the moonlight, his ears ringing with the echo of that single, whispered word. She murmured again, something unintelligible this time, before settling back into a deep, quiet sleep. But Eli couldn't move. The brief warmth he had felt in his chest moments before was extinguished, replaced by a profound and chilling cold that seeped into his very bones. It was the cold shock of absolute realization. The woman lying in that bed, the woman who shared his name, who cooked his meals and lived in his house, was a complete and utter stranger to him. He knew the color of her eyes, the quiet efficiency of her hands, the way she liked her coffee. But he didn't know her heart, he didn't know her soul, and he didn't know the man whose name she whispered in the dark. He turned and walked back to his room, not with the quiet footsteps of before, but with the heavy, leaden tread of a man who has just had the ground crumble away beneath him. He didn't get a drink of water. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared out at the moonlit landscape, at the hard, unforgiving land he knew so well. But it was the landscape of his own home, of his own marriage, that now seemed foreign and treacherous. The silence of the house was no longer comfortable. It was heavy, filled with unanswered questions and the ghost of a name, Samuel. And for the first time since she had arrived, Eli Vance felt truly, terrifyingly alone. The sun rose the next morning, indifferent as ever, but for Eli Vance, the world had been knocked off its axis. The familiar morning light that slanted across his bedroom floor seemed accusing. The smell of coffee from the kitchen, usually a comfort, now felt like a part of a charade. He was a man living in a stranger's house, or rather, a stranger was living in his... The name, Samuel, had echoed in the silence of his mind all night. A single word that had dismantled the simple, orderly structure of his life. He went about his morning chores with a mechanical precision, his movements stiff. He fed the horses, checked the pump, his mind not on the tasks, but on the woman in the house. When he came in for breakfast, she was there, moving with her usual quiet grace, placing a plate of eggs and salted pork before him. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time with a detective's eye. Before, he had seen a respectable, sorrowful woman. Now, he saw a puzzle, a landscape of secrets hidden behind a calm facade. Every simple gesture seemed fraught with hidden meaning. His observation became a quiet, consuming obsession in the days that followed. He was a man accustomed to reading the land, to noticing the subtle shift of the wind that foretold a storm, or the faint track of a coyote near the chickens. He now applied that same intense scrutiny to his wife. He began to notice things, small details that he had previously overlooked. He noticed the way she would pause her work in the late afternoon, when the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the porch. She would stand by the west-facing window in the parlor, her hands still, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if waiting for a rider to appear over the distant, dusty hills. There was a profound longing in her posture, a stillness so absolute it was almost painful to watch. It wasn't the tired gaze of a woman at the end of a long day. It was the vigil of someone waiting for a ghost. Who was she looking for out there in the twilight? The question burned in his mind. One afternoon, while gathering his mended shirts from the laundry basket, a small piece of white linen fell to the floor. It was a lady's handkerchief, finely made, with delicate lace at the edges. In one corner, embroidered with dark blue thread, was a single, elegant letter, N's. Not a C for Clara, not an A for her former name of Abernathy, and certainly not a V for Vance, N's. He held the small square of fabric in his calloused palm. It felt like a hot coal. Samuel. The letter was a brand, a physical piece of evidence of the man who occupied his wife's dreams. He imagined her tracing that letter with her finger, her thoughts 1,000 miles away. He folded it carefully and placed it back in the basket, the silence in the house suddenly feeling heavier, more suffocating. His search, though he was ashamed to admit it even to himself, grew bolder. One day, needing to find a spare ledger to track his sale of 2 steers, he went into the tall mahogany dresser in the parlor that Clara used for storing linens and other household items. He opened a bottom drawer, one he'd never had reason to look in before. Beneath a stack of neatly folded tablecloths, his fingers brushed against the hard spine of a small book. It was a journal, bound and worn, dark leather, held shut by a simple strap. It was old, the corners softened with use. There was no name on it, no identifying mark, but he knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that it was hers. It was a repository of the past she kept so fiercely hidden. The urge to open it, to tear back the veil and expose every secret, was a physical force, a fever in his blood. But he couldn't. Some deep-seated part of his honorable nature, the very core of the man he thought he was, held him back. To read her private thoughts would be a violation worse than any other. He pushed the drawer shut, the sound echoing in the quiet room like a gunshot, the knowledge that it was there, just feet from where they ate their silent suppers, was a constant, tormenting presence. The town, which had once been a source of simple community, now became a minefield of potential clues. The whispers about Clara, which he had once dismissed as idle, cruel gossip, now took on the chilling ring of truth. He went to the general store to buy a sack of flour and a new axe handle, and he listened. 2 old cattlemen, Jebediah and Silas, were talking by the pickle barrel. Always said there was something strange about Abernathy's death, Jebediah mumbled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a nearby spittoon. Man knew those trails like the back of his hand. Don't just fall off a cliff. It was that business with the cowboy that did it, Silas added, his voice a conspiratorial rasp. The one she was seen with, the one that vanished right after. Samuel, they called him. Eli's blood ran cold. He pretended to inspect a coil of rope, his ears straining. Came from down near the border. I heard, Jebediah continued. Some said he was a hero, a deserter from the war who'd had enough of killing. Others said he was an outlaw, running from a posse. Either way, he was trouble. And she, the pretty Mrs. Abernathy, was right in the middle of it. Then he disappears. And a month later, her husband's dead. Now she's married up with Vance. Lucky woman. Lucky. The word was a slap in the face. Eli paid for his goods, his face a grim mask, and left the store. The dust of the street seemed to choke him. So it wasn't just a dream. Samuel was a real man. A man with a reputation, a man connected to his wife, a man who had vanished. The town's gossip painted a picture so ugly and tangled it made him sick to his stomach. Had she been in love with this outlaw? Was her first husband's death truly an accident? The questions multiplied, breeding in the dark corners of his mind like rats. The poison of suspicion worked its way through him, curdling his gratitude into resentment, his respect into a bitter, unfamiliar jealousy. It was a humiliating emotion. He was a rancher, a man of substance, jealous of a ghost, a whisper. The helplessness of it was the worst part. He could fight a drought, mend a fence, break a wild horse, but he couldn't fight a memory. He couldn't force his way into the locked chambers of his wife's heart. The tension in the house grew until it was a palpable thing, a third presence at the dinner table. One evening, after another meal consumed in near total silence, the strain became too much to bear. He watched her clear the plates, her movements graceful and contained. His own frustration was a wild animal clawing at the inside of his chest. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, to break through the infuriating calm she wore like armor. He let the anger simmer, sharpening it to a fine point. He waited until she was done, until she sat in her chair by the hearth, her hands busy with some mending. The firelight flickered across her face, making shadows dance in the hollows of her cheeks. "Clara," he said, his voice harder than he intended. She looked up, her eyes wide and questioning in the dim light. He didn't soften his gaze. He let a measure of his bitterness show. "I have a question for you." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. "Have you ever loved a man so deeply, so completely, that you still call out his name in your dreams?" The question landed in the quiet room with a surgical precision. It was not an inquiry. It was an accusation. He saw the truth of it in her reaction. A flicker of sheer panic in her eyes, so quick he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so intently. The color drained from her face, leaving her as pale as bone china. Her hands, which had been deftly working the needle and thread, went perfectly still in her lap. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. A small, trapped breath was the only answer he received. And then, nothing. She simply stared at him, her expression shuddering, the wall of her composure sliding back into place. She did not deny it. She did not ask him what he meant. She offered no explanation. She just sat there, encased in a silence that was more damning than any confession. Her silence was his answer. It confirmed everything. Eli felt a cold, bitter triumph that was immediately soured by a wave of despair. He had his proof, but he was no closer to understanding. He stood up abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. "Good night," he said, his voice clipped and cold, and walked out of the room, leaving her alone in the flickering firelight. Clara felt the shift in him like a change in the weather. The respectful distance that had defined their marriage had been replaced by a cold, Arctic gulf. The air around him was different, heavy with a disapproval she couldn't name. She racked her brain, going over every chore, every meal, every word she had spoken, trying to find her transgression. She found nothing. The fear that she had somehow failed in her duties, that he would cast her out, was a constant, sickening knot in her stomach. She was a guest in his home, her position tenuous, and his coldness was a terrifying reminder of her own precariousness. But she was too afraid to ask, too afraid to hear the answer. To poke at his quiet anger felt like prodding a sleeping rattlesnake. A few evenings later, the oppressive heat of the day finally broke. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the scent of distant rain and dry earth. The sunset was spectacular, a riot of orange, pink, and deep purple that set the clouds ablaze. It was the kind of evening that made even the hardest heart feel a pang of beauty. Clara was bringing in the last of the laundry from the line when a gust of wind caught a white sheet, pulling it from her grasp. It billowed out like a sail before snagging on the corner of the water trough. Eli was walking from the barn, and he saw her struggling. He came over without a word and helped her wrestle the sheet free. As they folded the large piece of fabric, their hands brushed. It was a simple, accidental touch, but in the charged silence between them, it felt like a bolt of lightning. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the painted colors of the sky. He looked down at her. For a fleeting moment, the suspicion in his mind vanished. He saw not the woman with a secret past, not the widow who whispered another man's name, but just Clara. He saw the sadness in her eyes, the gentle curve of her mouth, the fine lines of worry on her brow. The protective tenderness he had felt that night while watching her sleep returned with a surprising force. The world seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them standing there in the glorious, fading light, a silent question hanging in the air between them. He could lean in. He could close the distance. He could offer a kind word, a gentle touch, and perhaps begin to build a bridge across the chasm that separated them. But then, the name returned to his mind, unbidden and venomous. Samuel. The ghost stepped between them, as real as the wooden porch beneath his feet, the image of the handkerchief with its embroidered, the thought of the hidden journal, the whispers of the men in town. It all came rushing back, dousing the fragile spark of connection with a wave of cold resentment. His face hardened. The softness in his eyes vanished, replaced by the familiar, stony mask. He let go of the sheet as if it had burned him and took a half-step back. He turned his face away from her, toward the barn, breaking the spell completely. "The air's getting cold," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You should get inside." Without another glance at her, he turned and walked away, his boots making a hollow sound on the packed earth, leaving her standing alone by the clothesline. Clara watched him go, her heart aching with a confusion and loneliness so profound it felt like a physical wound. The magnificent sunset continued its display, painting the sky with breathtaking beauty, but all she could feel was the chill of the evening and the profound, unbridgeable distance between herself and her husband. The fragile peace of their shared existence had been shattered, replaced by a silence so thick and heavy it felt like a physical weight. Eli's suspicion was no longer a phantom. It was a living entity that sat between them at the dinner table and lay with him in his narrow bed at night. The name Samuel was a splinter in his mind, and he knew he could find no peace until he worked it free, no matter how much it hurt. He could no longer wait for clues to fall into his lap. He had to go out and hunt for the truth himself. His first stop was not the saloon, but a man he trusted implicitly, Silas Hewitt, the postmaster. Silas was a gaunt, wiry man who had been in Stone Creek for 30 years. He saw every letter that came and went, heard every piece of news before it became common gossip, and possessed a quiet discretion that made him a keeper of the town's collective secrets. Eli found him sorting mail in the small, dusty office at the back of the general store. "Silas," Eli began, his voice low, "I need to ask you something." In confidence, Silas peered at him over his spectacles, his fingers never ceasing their methodical sorting. "Everything that's said in this room is in confidence. Eli, what's weighing on you?" "My wife, Clara," Eli said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "Before she was Mrs. Abernathy. Do you know where she came from?" Silas paused, setting down a letter addressed to the blacksmith. "She came from Willow Creek, about a 2-day ride east of here. Arrived with Abernathy about 2 years back, kept to herself mostly, even then." He looked at Eli, his gaze sharp. "Is there trouble?" "Just trying to understand some things." Eli hedged. "Did you ever know of her keeping company with anyone else? A man named Samuel, maybe?" The postmaster's face gave nothing away, but his eyes held a flicker of something. Pity, perhaps. "A name like that was mentioned last year, before Abernathy's accident. A letter came for her once. Return address was just a general delivery post down near the Mexican border. The name on it was Samuel Carter." Samuel W. Carter. The name from the gossip now had a tangible form. A letter, a connection. "Just one letter," Eli pressed. "Just one that I saw," Silas confirmed. Things were tense. After that, Abernathy was a loud man when he was in his cups, made a scene or two at the saloon. Then it all went quiet. The cowboy vanished, and a few weeks later, Abernathy took his fall. The timeline was a string of damning coincidences. Eli thanked Silas, his gut churning with a cold dread. The truth was a dark trail, and he was being led deeper into the woods. His next visit was to the saloon, a place he rarely frequented. He found the proprietor, a stout man named Bartholomew, wiping down the bar. Eli ordered a beer he had no intention of drinking and steered the conversation carefully. Bartholomew, lubricated by the prospect of a good story, was more forthcoming. "Aye, I remember her," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Pretty thing. Too quiet for a man like Abernathy. As for a cowboy, there was a young fella. Came through here for a few weeks. Dark hair, steady eyes. Didn't say much, but he could handle himself. Saw him get into a scrape with some rowdy prospectors, and he didn't even break a sweat." "Did you ever see him with Mrs. Abernathy?" Eli asked, his knuckles white around his beer mug. Bartholomew leaned in, his voice dropping. "More than once, but there was one time. It was a Sunday. I was out back, dumping some trash. And I saw them behind the church. The sun was going down. He was holding her, and she was crying. Then he kissed her. It wasn't a casual thing. Mind you, it was the kind of kiss that says 1,000 words, most of them goodbye. He straightened up, polishing a clean spot on the bar. He was gone the next day. Never saw him again. The image seared itself into Eli's mind. Clara, his Clara, in the arms of another man, sharing a desperate kiss behind the house of God. The betrayal was so profound, so visceral, it felt like a physical blow. He left the saloon, the untouched beer sweating on the bar, and rode home in a daze of cold fury. He now had a name and a place. Willow Creek. He told Clara he had to ride out to check on a distant herd, a plausible lie that she accepted with her usual quiet nod. The 2-day ride was a torment. Every clop of his horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth was a hammer blow, beating the names into his brain. Clara, Samuel, Clara, Samuel. The man who had been a whisper was now a fully formed ghost riding alongside him. A man who had held his wife, kissed his wife, and made her cry. Willow Creek was smaller and sadder than Stone Creek, a handful of buildings clinging to a dried-up riverbed. The church was old, its white paint peeling, its steeple leaning slightly to one side. He found the parish clerk, a stooped, elderly man named Mr. Abercrombie, in a small, book-lined office that smelled of decaying paper and lemon polish. Eli, using the excuse that he was a distant relative trying to trace a family tree, asked to see the marriage records from the previous year. The old man was reluctant, but Eli's serious demeanor and the silver dollar he placed on the desk persuaded him. He was led to a large, dusty ledger. He ran his finger down the columns, his heart pounding against his ribs. And then he saw it, an application for a marriage license, dated 1.5 years prior. The space for the bride's name read, in elegant, looping script, Clara Mayhew Abernathy, and for the groom, Samuel W. Carter. It was all there, her maiden name, her first husband's name, and the name of the man she whispered in her sleep. But it was the final section that delivered the killing blow. The lines for the officiant's signature and the final date of ceremony were blank. A single, stark word was scrawled across the bottom of the application in the clerk's spidery handwriting. Abandoned. He had been seconds away from marrying her. They were going to build a life together. What had happened? Had he left her at the altar? Or had something torn him away? The questions were irrelevant. The intent was there, written in black ink, a legally binding record of her heart. Eli had not married a widow grieving a dead husband. He had married a woman grieving a lost life, a lost love. He was the consolation prize, the respectable, sensible arrangement, a port in a storm, but not the destination she had ever wanted. The ride back was a blur of cold, simmering rage. The hurt was a physical stone in his chest. He felt like a fool, a blind man who had welcomed a viper into his home. The sky, sensing his mood, began to turn a bruised, ugly gray. By the time he was a few miles from the ranch, the first snowflakes began to fall. Not the gentle, quiet flakes of early winter, but hard, stinging pellets driven by a rising wind. He stabled his horse and walked into the house, the storm breaking outside just as the one inside him was about to. The warmth of the kitchen was a mockery. He ignored the supper she had left for him on the stove, went straight to the cabinet where he kept a bottle of whiskey for medicinal purposes, and poured himself a heavy glass. He never drank. It was a rule he lived by, a standard he set for himself. Tonight, he didn't care. Clara found him an hour later, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, the bottle half empty, the wind howling arias around the eaves of the house. The snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets now, a full-blown blizzard that had sealed them off from the rest of the world. "Eli?" she said, her voice small and laced with concern. She lit a lamp, and the flickering light cast his face in harsh shadows. He looked like a stranger, his features carved from granite. "You're drinking." "An observation," he slurred, his voice thick with a mixture of whiskey and contempt. "You're very good at observing, but not so good at talking. What's wrong? Did something happen with the herd?" He let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "The herd is fine. It's my home, that's the problem." He stood up, unsteady on his feet, and looked at her, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury. From his coat pocket, he pulled the folded, crumpled piece of paper he'd copied from the ledger in Willow Creek. "I was in your old town. Clara, or should I say, Mrs. Carter. It seems you were planning a wedding." He saw the blood drain from her face, the raw terror in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had when he'd asked her about her dreams. "Eli, Don't," he snarled, taking a step toward her. "Don't you dare lie to me now. Not after all this time, all the quiet meals, all the polite nods." "It was all a lie. You've been living in my house, eating my food, wearing my name, all while your heart was with another man." "You don't understand," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Then make me understand," he roared, his control finally snapping. "Make me understand why you whispered his name in my bed. Make me understand this." He threw the paper at her. It fluttered in the air between them before landing at her feet, a white accusation on the dark floorboards. That was what broke her. A sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound, gut-wrenching agony that it momentarily stunned him. She looked down at the paper, then back at him, her face a mask of utter desolation. And then she turned and ran. She fumbled with the latch on the kitchen door and plunged out into the screaming wind and the blinding snow. For a second, Eli stood frozen, his anger warring with a sudden sharp spike of fear. The blizzard was no mere storm. It was a killer. Out there, a person could get lost in minutes, freeze to death within the hour. The image of her, frozen and still in the snow, cut through the whiskey-fueled rage. "Clara!" he bellowed, grabbing his heavy coat and running out after her, the door slamming shut behind him. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The wind tore at his clothes, and the snow stung his eyes. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him. "Clara!" he yelled again, his voice swallowed by the gale. He followed her faint footprints, already disappearing under the fresh snow, leading away from the house, toward the outbuildings. He stumbled through the drifts, his heart hammering with a terror that was far stronger than his anger had ever been. He found her in the main barn. The large doors had been left ajar, and inside, the wind howled through the rafters, making the lantern swing wildly. She was huddled in a corner, collapsed in a pile of hay, shaking uncontrollably, her thin house dress already soaked through. He rushed to her side, falling to his knees in the dirt and straw. "Clara, what in God's name were you thinking?" he said, his voice raw. She looked up at him, her teeth chattering, her face streaked with tears and melting snow. I couldn't," she stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. They were both a mess, covered in snow, mud clinging to their clothes. He was soaked, and she was half frozen. All the layers of their polite, distant marriage had been stripped away by the storm, inside and out. All that was left was the raw, undeniable truth of their situation. Two desperately lonely people, trapped by a ghost and a blizzard. He reached out, intending to pull her to her feet, to get her back into the warmth of the house, but when his hands touched her arms, something shifted. The coldness of her skin, the violent trembling of her body, the absolute despair in her eyes, it all converged into a single, overwhelming impulse. His anger was still there, a hot coal in his chest. His hurt was a gaping wound. Her fear and sorrow were a tangible presence in the air. But beneath it all, there was something else, something that had been repressed and denied for months, a current of raw, desperate need. He pulled her toward him, and his mouth found hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was fierce, punishing, and desperate. It was a kiss of rage and confusion, of blame and a strange, aching forgiveness. It tasted of whiskey and snow and tears. Her hands came up, gripping his coat, her fingers digging into the thick wool as if she were drowning. She kissed him back with the same wild, chaotic energy, a lifetime of pent-up sorrow and fear and longing pouring out of her. It was a collision, not an embrace, a desperate, angry, passionate confirmation that they were both still alive in the heart of the storm. The morning after the blizzard broke clear and cold, the world outside scrubbed clean and silent under a thick blanket of white. Inside the ranch house, the silence was of a different kind. It was brittle and heavy, thick with the unspoken words and unresolved emotions of the night before. The storm had passed, but the wreckage remained. Clara moved about the kitchen like a ghost, her face pale and her eyes downcast. She was wrapped in a thick shawl, but it did little to ward off the chill that seemed to emanate from within. She was ashamed, not of the kiss itself, but of the raw, violent exposure of it all. Her carefully constructed walls had been breached, her deepest secrets thrown at her feet, and she had shattered. Now, she tried to piece herself back together, retreating into a silence so profound it was almost a physical presence. Eli watched her from the doorway, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands. His head ached from the whiskey, but his heart ached with a more potent cocktail of guilt and confusion. The anger of the previous night had burned itself out, leaving behind the bitter ash of regret. He had pushed her, cornered her, and taken advantage of her despair in that wild moment in the barn. He wanted to apologize, to say something that could mend the gaping wound he had torn in their fragile arrangement. But the words wouldn't form. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry I discovered the truth. I'm sorry I'm not him." Every potential apology felt like another accusation. So he said nothing. He simply finished his coffee, pulled on his boots, and went outside to begin the long, arduous task of digging out from the snow. For days, they coexisted in this new, agonizing tension. The polite distance was gone, replaced by a raw awareness of each other. They were like two fighters in a ring after the bell has rung, bruised and wary, circling each other in their own home. The snow melted, and the world did not spring back to life. Instead, the thaw gave way to a relentless, punishing sun. The blizzard, it turned out, was winter's last gasp. Spring was a fleeting, thirsty affair, and summer arrived early and with a vengeance. The sky turned a hard, cloudless blue and stayed that way for weeks, then months. The creek that bisected Eli's property shrank from a lively stream to a sluggish trickle, and finally, to a series of stagnant, muddy pools. The earth cracked open like a parched mouth, and the pastures, usually green and lush, were baked a uniform, brittle brown. A devastating drought had settled over the land. The hardship, which should have driven them further apart, instead began to forge a new, unspoken bond between them. Survival became their only shared language. Their personal turmoil was a luxury they could no longer afford. The ranch demanded their every waking moment, their every ounce of strength. The struggle was no longer between them, but with the land itself. Eli worked from sunup to sundown, his face burned dark by the sun, his body aching with a fatigue that went bone deep. He spent days digging at a new well site, his pickaxe ringing a lonely, rhythmic beat against the stubborn, rocky soil. Clara, in turn, worked with a quiet, tireless determination. She hauled bucket after bucket of precious water from the dwindling supply to her vegetable garden, a small patch of green she refused to let die. She learned to cook jackrabbit and other small game Eli brought in, stretching their dwindling supplies with a grim efficiency. They rarely spoke, but they began to communicate in other ways. One afternoon, as Eli toiled in the dry well pit under the merciless sun, he looked up to see Clara standing at the edge, holding out a metal dipper of cool water from the cistern. She didn't say a word, just waited, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed sunbonnet. He climbed out, took the dipper, and drank deeply, the water a shock of life in his parched throat. He handed it back to her, their fingers brushing for a brief second. "Thank you," he rasped, the first kind words that had passed between them in months. She simply nodded and walked back to the house. Another time, he found a patch of wild berries growing in the shade of a rocky outcrop, and he picked them for her, leaving the pail on the kitchen table without announcement. That evening, they had a small berry cobbler for dessert, a sweet, unexpected reprieve from the bleakness of their daily fare. They were small gestures, silent offerings in the vast, quiet space between them. They were becoming partners. Not husband and wife, not yet, but partners in a desperate war against the unforgiving sun. The cattle suffered the most. They grew thin, their ribs showing through their hides, their calls low and mournful. One of the new calves, born just weeks before, took sick. It was too weak to stay with the herd. So Eli brought it to the small corral behind the barn. It was Clara who took it upon herself to nurse the creature. She would carry buckets of water up the small, rocky hill to the corral several times a day, coaxing the calf to drink, bathing its feverish head with a damp cloth. It was on one of these trips that disaster struck. The path was treacherous, littered with loose stones and dry, thorny brush. Clara, her arms aching from the weight of the two heavy pails, was focused on her footing when she stepped over a sun-warmed ledge of rock. She felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her ankle, hot as a branding iron. She cried out and dropped the buckets, which clattered down the rocks, spilling their precious contents into the dust. Looking down, she saw it, the two small, bloody punctures on her skin, just above her boot line, coiled a few feet away. Its tail buzzing in angry, hypnotic rhythm, was a rattlesnake. Panic seized her. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs, and tried to run, but her leg was already beginning to throb with a fiery, venomous pain. She managed a few steps before the world began to swim and her leg gave out from under her. Eli was in the barn, mending a harness, when he heard her cry. It was a sound of pure terror, sharp and immediate. He dropped his tools and ran outside. He saw the spilled buckets, and then he saw her, crumpled on the ground halfway up the path. "Clara!" he shouted, his blood running cold. He sprinted up the hill, his boots skidding on the loose gravel. When he reached her side, he saw the bite, already beginning to swell and discolor. The snake was gone. All his anger, all his resentment, all the hurt and suspicion he had harbored for months, evaporated in a single, terrifying instant. None of it mattered. All that mattered was the woman lying on the ground, her face a mask of pain and fear. "It's all right," he said, his voice surprisingly steady as a primal, protective instinct took over. "I've got you." He acted with the swift, practical knowledge of a man who has lived his whole life in a hostile land. He gently but firmly pushed her down, forcing her to lie still. He pulled a knife from the sheath on his belt and, without hesitation, sliced two small, shallow crosses over the fang marks. He put his mouth to the wound and drew on it, spitting the blood and venom onto the dusty ground. He did this again and again, his mind a blank slate of pure, focused intent. Then, he tore a strip of cloth from the bottom of his shirt and tied it tightly around her leg, just above the knee. He lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, almost frail. She moaned, her head falling against his shoulder, her breath coming in shallow gasps. He carried her back to the house, his own heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since he was a child lost in a storm. He laid her gently on her bed, the one in the master bedroom he had never entered. He worked quickly, removing her boot and stocking, cleaning the wound with whiskey, and applying a poultice of herbs he knew could help draw out poison. Her leg was swollen and purplish, and a fever was already beginning to set in. For the next 2 days, he did not leave her side. He sat in a wooden chair by her bed, a silent, tireless sentinel. He bathed her face with cool water, forced sips of broth and willow bark tea between her cracked lips, and listened to her fevered, nonsensical murmuring. In her delirium, she cried out names he didn't know, a woman named Mary, a man named Father Thomas, but she never once said the name Samuel. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. He was dozing in the chair when he felt a faint touch on his hand. His eyes snapped open. She was awake, her own eyes clear for the first time in days, though they were shadowed with exhaustion. "Eli," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "You saved me." He simply nodded, his throat too tight for words. He gave her a drink of water, and she drank gratefully. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound, the chirping of crickets outside the open window. The lamplight cast a soft, golden glow over the room. "I need to tell you," she said finally, her voice gaining a little strength. "I should have told you from the beginning. About Samuel." Eli steeled himself, but the old anger wasn't there. There was only a weary sadness and a deep, consuming need to finally understand. He just listened. "He saved me, too," she began, her gaze fixed on the ceiling as if she were watching a story unfold there. "It was before I was married to Mr. Abernathy. I was still new to this territory, and I got lost while picking berries in the woods. 2 men found me, prospectors. They were not kind men. They had been drinking." She paused, and a shudder ran through her. They had me cornered. I thought I was going to die. And then he was just there. He came out of the trees like a ghost. He didn't have a gun, just a knife in his hands. But he moved so fast. There was a fight. It was terrible. But he drove them off. He was hurt, a cut on his arm. But he didn't seem to care. He just looked at me and asked if I was all right. Eli pictured the scene, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The faceless cowboy was no longer a rival. He was a protector. His name was Samuel Carter. She continued. He was an outcast. He told me the truth right away. He'd fought in the war, but he'd seen things that broke something inside him. And he walked away. He was a deserter, in the eyes of the law, and of most people. That made him a criminal, a coward. But he was the bravest man I ever knew. He was gentle and kind, and he understood the quiet, broken places in people because he had them, too. We fell in love. It was fast and desperate and true. We knew we couldn't have a life in the open, not with his past. So we planned to leave, to go west to California and start over where no one knew us. We were going to be married by the preacher in Willow Creek, the day before the wedding. He went into town to buy a new horse, and he never came back. Her voice broke, and a single tear traced a path down her temple. I waited for days, then weeks. I was sure he was dead. I later heard that some soldiers had passed through, looking for deserters. I think they took him. I'll never know for sure. He just vanished. I was alone and shamed. Mr. Abernathy offered me a way out, a respectable name. I took it because I didn't know what else to do. It was a mistake. He was not a good man. She closed her eyes. When he died, I was alone again, and then you came. You were decent and kind, and you offered me safety. So I buried it all. I buried Samuel so deep I thought I'd never have to feel it again. But some ghosts, they don't stay buried. She fell silent, her story finished. The air in the room was thick with the weight of it. Eli looked at the woman in the bed, this stranger he had married, and for the first time, he felt he could see her. He saw the frightened girl in the woods, the young woman in love, the heartbroken bride who never was, the grieving widow, twice over. His jealousy felt like a small, petty thing in the face of her monumental sorrow. He had been angry with her for having a ghost. He had never once considered that she was the one who was truly haunted. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a moment before gently brushing the tear from her cheek. It was a gesture of peace, a silent acknowledgement of her pain. And in the quiet lamplight of the sick room, something new and fragile began to grow between them, rising from the ashes of their shared grief. Clara's story, once told, did not immediately fill the house with conversation. Instead, it deepened the silence, but changed its nature entirely. The tense, brittle quiet of suspicion was replaced by something softer, more contemplative. It was the silence of a landscape after a long, soaking rain, a quiet that allows for new things to grow. For days, Eli moved through his life in a thoughtful haze. The ghost of Samuel Carter was no longer a rival to be hated, but a figure of profound tragedy. He saw the world, his wife, his home, his own heart, through a new lens. He looked at Clara as she went about her chores, her movements still quiet and reserved. But he no longer saw a secretive stranger. He saw a woman of immense, hidden strength, a woman who had survived more loss than most people could imagine. He felt a hot, creeping shame when he thought of his earlier behavior, his coldness, his cruel, pointed questions, the rage in the barn. He had been jealous of a memory, a man who had been Clara's savior before he was her love. He, Eli Vance, with his solid ranch and his respected name, felt small and petty. He had offered her a roof and security, a practical arrangement. Samuel had offered her his life, a grand and total love that was ultimately torn from her grasp. There was no comparison. He found he could not be jealous of Samuel. He could only be humbled by him. This new, fragile understanding was still taking root when the past rode into Stone Creek. A stranger appeared one afternoon at the saloon. He was not a local, nor was he a passing ranch hand. He was lean and weathered, with dark, searching eyes and a quiet intensity that set him apart. He moved with a purpose. He bought a whiskey, but asked the proprietor, Bartholomew, for information instead of gossip. The name he spoke was Samuel W. Carter. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Stone Creek. By the time Eli arrived to pick up a delivery of rock salt from the general store, the stranger was the only topic of conversation. Eli saw him from across the street, a solitary figure nursing a drink on the saloon porch. There was something in the line of his jaw, in the way he stared out at the dusty street. That felt familiar, echoing the man Clara had described. Eli's business in the store was brief, but he lingered long enough to hear the story. The stranger called himself Jedediah Carter. He claimed Samuel was his older brother, not his cousin. He said he'd received a letter a year and a half ago, a letter from Samuel saying he'd found the woman he was going to marry and was leaving his old life behind. And then, nothing. Jedediah had waited, but no other word ever came. He had come here, to the last place he knew his brother had been, looking for answers. He didn't believe Samuel was the kind of man to just disappear. He feared his brother was dead. Eli's blood ran cold. This changed everything. Samuel hadn't been arrested by soldiers. That was just Clara's desperate, hopeful theory. According to his own brother, he had been here, ready to start a new life, and then he had vanished into thin air. He rode home with a heavy heart, the news a leaden weight in his gut. He found Clara in her garden, tending to the small, hardy plants that had survived the drought. He watched her for a moment, the setting sun catching the gold in her hair, and he dreaded the words he was about to speak. "Clara," he said gently. She stood and turned, a small, questioning smile on her face. It was a true smile, one he was just beginning to see more often, and he hated that he had to be the one to wipe it away. He told her everything about the man in town, Jedediah, who he was, and why he was there. As he spoke, he watched the life drain from her face. Her shoulders slumped. The color vanished from her cheeks, and the old, haunted look returned to her eyes, more potent than ever before. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It can't be. He wouldn't be here." "He is," Eli said, his voice firm but kind. "He says Samuel is his brother. He thinks he's dead. Clara, he thinks something happened to him right here, near Stone Creek." Her panic was a palpable thing, a frantic, desperate energy. "He has to leave. Eli, you have to make him leave. He'll stir everything up. People will look at me. They'll whisper again. They'll blame me." Eli's mind was already working past the town gossip. His practical nature saw the inconsistencies, the dark possibilities. "Clara, listen to me. If Samuel was taken by soldiers, why would his brother be here looking for answers? Soldiers leave a record. This is something different. You said Abernathy was not a good man. Was he a jealous man?" "He was possessive," she admitted, her voice trembling. "He hated that I had a life before him." A dark suspicion began to form in Eli's mind. A cowboy disappears the day before he's set to marry a man's wife. A few weeks later, that same man has a convenient, fatal accident. Could Abernathy have had something to do with it? He asked quietly. Could he have wanted to get Samuel out of the way? The question hung in the air, terrible and real. It was a possibility Clara had clearly never allowed herself to consider. The idea that Samuel hadn't just been taken, but had been murdered. Murdered to silence him, to remove him from her life, was a horror beyond anything she had imagined. She wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden, violent shudder racking her body. The past wasn't just a sad story. It was a crime scene, and Jedediah's arrival was about to unearth the body. That night, the nightmares began. Eli was woken by a cry from across the hall, a sharp, strangled sound of pure terror. He lit a lamp and went to her room. He found her tangled in her sheets, her body tense, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Her eyes were closed, but she was thrashing, caught in the grip of a dream. "No, please, leave him be," she moaned, her voice pleading. "Samuel, run!" His heart broke for her. He sat on the edge of the bed and put a hand on her shoulder. "Clara," he said softly. "Clara, wake up. You're safe." Her eyes flew open, wide and unseeing for a moment before they focused on his face. Recognition dawned, and with it, a wave of fresh tears. She was back in the present, but the horror of the dream still clung to her. Without a second thought, Eli did what he would have never dared to do before. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her into a sitting position and holding her against his chest. She was trembling like a leaf in a storm. He held her firmly, his hand stroking her hair, murmuring quiet, soothing words. "It's all right. I'm here. It was just a dream. You're safe now." He didn't hold her with the anger and desperation of the night in the barn. He held her with a tenderness and compassion that was entirely new. There was no resentment left in him, no trace of the wronged husband. There was only a deep, profound empathy for the terrified woman in his arms. He was no longer just her husband by contract. He was her protector. He held her for a long time, until her trembling subsided and her breathing evened out, until she finally slumped against him, exhausted and asleep. The next day, to give her a reprieve from the oppressive atmosphere of the town, Eli suggested they ride out to the north pasture to check on the herd. They needed a count, and the air would do them both good. They spent the day under the vast, open sky, the familiar work a soothing balm. That night, they made a small camp by a cluster of cottonwood trees. After a simple meal of bacon and beans, they sat by the crackling fire, the flames pushing back the immense darkness of the plains. Above them, the sky was a velvet blanket, punched through with a million glittering stars. The silence was different here, not the tense quiet of the house, but a deep, peaceful quiet that belonged to the land itself. Clara had been watching the flames, her face soft in the firelight. She turned to him, her eyes shining with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Thank you, Eli," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For last night, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," he said, his own voice low, Yes, I do, she insisted. You've been kinder to me than I deserve. No, he said, looking at her, seeing all the pain and strength and grace she held within her. You deserve more kindness than you've ever known. A silent understanding passed between them in the flickering light. All the walls were down. There were no more secrets, no more resentment, no more ghosts standing between them. Only two people who had found an unlikely solace in each other. The loneliness that had defined both their lives was, for the first time, gone. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused thumb stroking the back of her palm. She leaned into his touch, her gaze never leaving his. He moved closer, and when he kissed her, it was with a gentleness that was almost reverent. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a question and an answer all in one. She returned the kiss with a quiet, total surrender. This was not the chaotic collision in the barn. This was a willing, conscious choice made by two hearts that had finally found their way to each other through a wilderness of pain. Later, they lay together on a bedroll under the stars, wrapped in a single blanket. Their coming together was as quiet and natural as the landscape around them. It was an act of love born not of wild passion, but of deep, resonant intimacy. It was a confirmation of the promises they had made with their silent acts of care, a tender and profound joining that healed more than it aroused. It was a silent vow, made in the heart of the vast, lonely West, a promise that neither of them would ever have to be alone again. As they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, the campfire burned down to embers, its warm glow a small, steadfast light in the immense and peaceful dark. The peaceful interlude at the campfire was a breath of clean air before a plunge into murky waters. Returning to the ranch, the reality of Jedediah Carter's presence in Stone Creek and the dark questions he had unearthed settled back over them. But this time, Eli and Clara faced it together. The ghost of Samuel was no longer a wall between them. He was a shared cause, a wrong that demanded to be righted. Eli, a man who lived his life by the simple, unshakable pillars of right and wrong, knew he could not rest until he found the truth. His investigation began not with accusations, but with quiet, methodical work. He found Jedediah Carter at the town's small boarding house. Samuel's brother was a man consumed by a cold, quiet grief, and he recognized in Eli an unlikely but steadfast ally. Together, they began to piece together Samuel's last days. They started at the livery, where Samuel had indeed gone to purchase a horse. The stable owner remembered him well. Fine young man. The owner, a grizzled man named Peterson, recalled. Paid in cash for a strong bay mare. Said he was heading out for California, starting a new life. Seemed happier than any man I'd ever seen. He scratched his beard. Funny thing, though, a couple of fellas were asking after him later that day. Not soldiers, rough-looking men. They rode horses from the Thorn Ranch. The name landed like a stone in a quiet pond. Marcus Thorn, the powerful, pious landowner, the father of Clara's first husband, the deceased and unlamented Mr. Abernathy. Eli and Jedediah spent the next few days riding the trails radiating out from Willow Creek, where Samuel had filed the marriage license. They spoke to prospectors, trappers, and isolated homesteaders, asking if they'd seen a man on a bay mare around that time. The trail was nearly 2 years old, cold as a winter creek bed, but Eli's persistence was relentless. It was an old, half-senile sheep herder living in a rickety cabin miles from any town who gave them their first real clue. He remembered a commotion on the old ridge trail. Heard shouting, the old man mumbled, his eyes milky with age. Thought it was just drunks, then a single gunshot. After that, quiet. He remembered seeing 2 men riding away, leading a bay mare without a rider. He'd been too scared to go and look, too wise to get involved in other men's violent business. Guided by the old man's vague directions, Eli and Jedediah found the spot. It was a narrow pass, flanked by a steep, rocky drop-off on one side. The kind of place the sheriff had described when Abernathy had his accident. They searched the area for hours. It was Eli who found it, tucked deep in a crevice between two rocks, shielded from the elements. It was the rusted, corroded barrel of a pistol. It was not a standard cavalry model, nor a common make like a Colt. It was a more expensive, custom-engraved Remington, the kind of weapon a wealthy man might own. But the most damning discovery came a few yards away, at the base of the ravine, hidden by a thick growth of thorny bushes. They found the sun-bleached skeleton of a horse, a bay mare. There had been no accident. An ambush was the only thing that made sense. Samuel had been shot, his body taken, and his horse sent over the edge to make it look like a tragic fall. They had staged the same scene twice. The men from the Thorn Ranch, the expensive pistol, the identical method. All the threads were leading back to one dark, powerful spider at the center of the web. That evening, Eli laid out his findings for Clara in the quiet of their kitchen. He spoke in a low, steady voice, presenting the facts without emotion, as if he were describing a problem with his herd. The men who were asking after Samuel worked for your first father-in-law, Marcus Thorn, Eli concluded, his eyes fixed on her face. The sheepherder heard a gunshot. We found Samuel's horse at the bottom of a ravine, the same way they found Abernathy. I believe Thorn's men killed him. Clara, I believe they ambushed him on the trail and made him disappear so he couldn't marry you. Clara listened, her face growing paler with every word. She wrapped her arms around herself, a familiar gesture of self-protection. But when she spoke, her voice was not filled with fear, but with a chilling certainty. He warned me, she whispered, her eyes wide with the memory. After I told Mr. Abernathy I couldn't marry him, that I was leaving with Samuel, his father sent for me. Marcus Thorn, he sat behind his big desk, looking at me like I was something he'd scraped off his boot. He told me I would marry his son, that the honor of his family depended on it. She took a shaky breath. I refused. I told him I loved Samuel. And he looked at me, his eyes as cold as a winter sky. And he said, "This cowboy of yours is a temporary problem. My dear, you will do as you are told. If you do not, Samuel Carter will simply disappear. Forever." The threat, once a vague and terrifying warning, now had the solid, undeniable weight of a fulfilled prophecy. Clara began to weep, not from fear, but from a terrible, crushing guilt. I thought he was just trying to scare me, she sobbed. I never thought, oh, God, Eli, I'm the reason he's dead. I should have listened. We should have just run. Eli moved to her, kneeling before her chair and taking her trembling hands in his. No, he said, his voice fierce with conviction. This is not your fault. This is the fault of one evil man. You didn't kill him. Clara, Marcus Thorn did. In that moment, his resolve hardened from suspicion into absolute certainty. This was no longer just about finding the truth. It was about claiming justice. The following Sunday, the church in Stone Creek was full, as it always was. Marcus Thorn sat in the front pew, his back ramrod straight, his silver hair gleaming. He was the picture of piety and civic authority, a man who owned half the valley and held the other half in his debt. The sermon ended. The final hymn was sung, and the preacher was about to give the benediction when Eli Vance stood up from his place in the middle of the pews. A murmur went through the congregation. No one ever interrupted the end of a service. Reverend, forgive me, Eli said, his voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the small church. But there is a matter of justice that needs to be brought into the house of the Lord. He turned his gaze from the preacher and fixed it directly on the man in the front pew. Marcus Thorn. Thorn turned slowly, his face a mask of polite inquiry, but his eyes were cold and hard as obsidian. The entire church held its breath. 1.5 years ago, a good man named Samuel Carter vanished from this territory. Eli continued, his voice ringing with righteous anger. He was set to be married, to start a new life. But he was ambushed, murdered, and his death was covered up. He was murdered by men who worked for you, on your orders." Gasps rippled through the pews. Thorne's face tightened, a flicker of pure fury in his eyes before it was replaced by a look of condescending pity. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "You seem to be unwell. Grief can do strange things to a man's mind. Perhaps you should go home and rest." "I'm not grieving," Eli shot back, taking a step into the aisle. "I'm demanding justice. You threatened Clara Abernathy. You told her that if she didn't marry your son, Samuel Carter would disappear forever. Did you think that secret would die with him? Did you think God wasn't watching from a place higher than your front row pew?" The direct accusation, the use of Thorne's own words, struck home. For the first time, a crack appeared in the landowner's perfect facade. His face flushed a dark, mottled red. He rose to his full height, a truly intimidating figure. "These are the ravings of a madman. Sheriff," he called, looking at the portly man in the back. "Remove this man from the church. He is disturbing the peace." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to lay a hand on Eli Vance, but terrified of disobeying Marcus Thorne. Before he could move, Eli spoke again. "Jedediah Carter is in this town, looking for his brother. The truth will come out, Mr. Thorne, and you will answer for your sins, in this life or the next." Without another word, Eli turned and walked down the aisle, Clara rising to meet him at the end of the pew. She took his hand, her grip firm, her head held high. Together, they walked out of the church, leaving behind a stunned, whispering congregation and the silent, murderous rage of Marcus Thorne. The confrontation had shattered the town's placid surface, and the consequences were swift. That night, as Eli was walking from the barn to the house, two men stepped out of the shadows. They were large and brutish, the same men the livery owner had described. "Vance," one of them growled. "Mister, Thorne doesn't appreciate you running your mouth off in public. He considers it unhealthy." "Get off my land," Eli said, his body tense, his hand inching toward the axe he'd left by the woodpile. "We're just here to deliver a message," the other man said with a sneer. "You got a nice, quiet life here. A pretty new wife. It'd be a shame if something were to happen to it. Or to her. Accidents happen all the time in this country. Just ask Samuel Carter." The threat was vile and unambiguous. They wanted him to back down, to be silenced by fear for Clara's safety. Eli's rage was a hot fire in his belly, but he was outnumbered and unarmed. He stood his ground, his jaw tight with defiance. After a long, tense moment, the men laughed, a low, ugly sound, and melted back into the darkness. Eli walked into the house, his heart pounding, his hands clenched into fists. Clara saw the look on his face and knew immediately that something was wrong. He told her what had happened, what Thorne's men had said. "Maybe I was wrong to do it. Clara," he said, his voice rough with anguish. "To put you in this kind of danger, we could leave. We could sell the ranch and go somewhere Thorne can't reach us." He was offering her an escape, an exit from the fight he had started. Clara looked at him, at the good, honorable man who had risked everything to defend the memory of a man he'd never even met. She saw the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. In that moment, all her old fear, all her instinct to hide and retreat, was burned away by a fierce, protective love. She had spent years running from the past, trying to bury it. But the past was here, and it was threatening to destroy the future she was just beginning to believe in. She stepped forward and placed her hands on his chest, right over his heart. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong, without a trace of a tremor. "We're not running. I've been silent for too long. I let that man's threats control my life once, and it cost Samuel everything. I won't let him take you from me. Two." She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "You stood up for Samuel. Now I'm standing with you. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Clara's declaration of solidarity was a vow, and it was tested sooner than either of them could have imagined. With their alliance forged, a new, quiet confidence settled in the house. The fear was still present, a low hum beneath the surface of their days, but it was no longer paralyzing. They had chosen their path, and they would walk it together. Eli, with Jedediah Carter's help, began to build a formal case, documenting their findings and searching for anyone else brave enough to speak out against Marcus Thorne. But Thorne was not a man to wait for his enemies to assemble their armies. A few days later, Eli rode out to check the fence line along the northern edge of his property, where the rolling pastures gave way to a dense, wooded forest. He promised to be back before dusk. The afternoon wore on, the shadows of the cottonwood trees growing long and thin across the yard. Dusk began to settle, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and rose, and still, there was no sign of him. Clara felt the first cold tendrils of fear. Eli was a man of his word, as dependable as the sunrise. If he said he would be home, he would be home. She stood on the porch, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her eyes scanning the darkening horizon. The familiar landscape suddenly seemed menacing, the whispering woods, a place of hidden dangers. When full darkness fell and the first stars appeared, the fear became a roaring in her ears. She lit every lamp in the house, as if their small, defiant lights could somehow guide him home. But by the time the moon was high in the sky, she knew she could wait no longer. Something was terribly wrong. Saddling her own horse, a steady mare named Bess, and grabbing a rifle she barely knew how to use, she rode out into the night, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She followed the trail he would have taken, calling his name until her voice was raw, the sound swallowed by the immense, indifferent silence of the plains. She found him just inside the tree line. His horse was grazing nearby, its reins tangled in a bush. Eli was on the ground, half conscious, his back against a large pine tree. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his left thigh. Even in the pale moonlight, she could see it was blood. "Eli!" she cried, leaping from her horse and rushing to his side. He was pale and his skin was cold, but his eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice. "Clara!" he rasped, his voice weak. "Ambush. 2 of them. Waited for me in the trees." She saw the wound then, a ragged, weeping hole in his leg. A gunshot. They had made good on their threat. They had tried to kill him and left him for dead in the wilderness. A wave of pure, cold rage washed over her, momentarily eclipsing her fear. Getting him back to the main ranch house was impossible. He was a dead weight, and the journey was too far. But she remembered a place, an old, abandoned line shack a mile deeper into the property, used by ranchers in his father's day. It was barely a shelter, but it had a roof and a hearth. It would have to do. The next hour was a desperate, agonizing struggle. She managed to get him onto his horse, his body slumping against the pommel, and led the animal slowly through the dark woods, her own hand gripping the rifle tightly, her eyes darting into the shadows. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of terror through her. The shack was dilapidated, a one-room cabin of rough-hewn logs, but it was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. Inside, she eased him off the horse and onto a dusty, straw-filled bunk, working by the frantic, flickering light of a single lantern. She saw the true extent of his injury. The bullet had gone clean through, but the wound was torn and bleeding sluggishly. Infection, she knew, was now the greatest danger. For the next few days, the small, forgotten cabin became their entire world. Clara worked with a strength and focus she never knew she possessed. She tore strips from her own petticoat for bandages. She cleaned the wound with the last of the whiskey from Eli's saddle flask. She gathered firewood, hauled water from a nearby spring, and kept a fire roaring day and night, fighting off the feverish chills that racked his body. She probed the wound with a heated knife to make sure no cloth or debris remained. an act that caused Eli to cry out in a raw agony that tore at her own soul. She sat by his side, bathing his face, forcing him to drink a bitter tea made from willow bark, and whispering to him, telling him to hold on, that he was not allowed to leave her. In the crucible of that small, isolated room, all pretense was stripped away. They were no longer the respectable rancher and his quiet wife. They were just a man and a woman, fighting for a life, bound together by blood, sweat, and a fierce, desperate love. On the third night, his fever finally broke. He woke to find her asleep in a chair beside him, her head slumped forward, her face etched with exhaustion in the soft firelight. His leg was a throbbing monument of pain, but his mind was clear. He watched her, this woman who had dragged him from the jaws of death, who had fought for him with the ferocity of a she-wolf, and he was overwhelmed by a love so powerful it was a physical ache in his chest. When she stirred and opened her eyes, she found him watching her. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of relief and exhaustion and a love that was too big to hold inside. "You're back," she whispered. He reached for her hand, his grip still weak. "Thanks to you." The pain, the fear, the relief, it all spilled over. She knelt by his bunk, burying her face in the rough blanket that covered him, and wept. He stroked her hair, his own eyes wet. In that moment, their shared trauma and profound gratitude fused into something else, something elemental and undeniable. He gently pulled her toward him, and she came willingly, carefully lying beside him on the narrow bunk. They held each other, a tangle of limbs and bandages and aching hearts. Their union was not one of fierce passion, but of a deep, soul-bearing intimacy. It was a desperate, life-affirming cleaving together, a way of saying without words that they had almost lost everything and had found it again in each other. It was a sacred, silent promise, made in a dusty cabin, full of tears and the metallic tang of sweat and blood. A love without barriers, forged in fire and fear. Later, as they lay in the quiet darkness, the fire burning down to embers, he spoke, his voice low and raspy. "Clara," he said, "when I was lying out there, waiting, I didn't think about the ranch, or the money, or my name. I only thought of you." He paused, gathering his strength. "I don't care about Samuel. I don't care who you loved before. He was a part of your story, and I can honor that. But all I want, all I've ever wanted since I truly saw you, is for you to choose me, for this to be our story. Now." "It is," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she kissed his chapped lips. "It always will be." Her resolve, which had been forged in the church, was now tempered to steel. While Eli slowly healed, she rode back to Stone Creek, not as a frightened widow, but as a woman with a mission. She went straight to Jedediah Carter. "They tried to kill him," she said, her voice shaking with a cold fury. "Thorne's men, that's all the proof I need. We're going to finish this." Clara, with Jedediah at her side, became an avenging angel. She went to Silas, the postmaster, who, horrified by the news of Eli's attack, agreed to help. She went to Bartholomew, the saloon owner, who felt a similar shame for his silence. A small, brave coalition began to form. Her first act was to unlock the past she had so carefully buried. In the bottom of her old trunk, she found them, a small, ribbon-tied bundle of Samuel's letters. They were beautiful, filled with a wanderer's poetry and a deep, abiding love for her, speaking of their plans for a life in California. They were proof of the depth and seriousness of their relationship. Next, with Jedediah, she rode out to the sheepherder's cabin. The old man was terrified, but Clara spoke to him not with threats, but with a quiet empathy. She told him what had happened to Eli, how the same men were still hurting people. She appealed to the small, buried spark of decency within him. He finally, reluctantly, agreed to tell what he knew. The final piece came from Silas. He recalled that Marcus Thorne had filed a false deed claim on a piece of land near the ravine right after Samuel had disappeared, a claim that required the signature of a witness who had supposedly been there. That witness was a drunkard who had been paid handsomely by Thorne and had left town a week later. The paperwork was a clear attempt to create a legal alibi for his men being in that specific area at that specific time. It was a forgery, and it was arrogant. They didn't go to the sheriff, who was firmly in Thorne's pocket. Instead, they petitioned the circuit judge, a stern but fair man named Hawthorne, who was due in town for his quarterly session. They demanded a public town hearing. The day of the hearing, the town hall was packed to the rafters. Eli, pale and leaning heavily on a crutch, sat in the front row. Marcus Thorne was there, flanked by his lawyers, his face a mask of arrogant indignation. It was Clara who stood before the assembly. Her voice, clear and strong, filled the room. She told them everything. She spoke of her love for Samuel Carter. She read from his letters, her voice breaking only once. She told them of Thorne's threat, of how Samuel had vanished the day before their wedding. Jedediah stood and spoke of his brother, a good man, not the outlaw Thorne's whispers had painted him to be. The sheepherder shuffled forward and mumbled his story about the gunshot and the riderless horse. Silas presented the forged deed claim, explaining the fraudulent timeline. Finally, Clara spoke of the attack on her husband, Eli Vance, a man whose only crime was to seek justice for the dead. She looked directly at Thorne, her gaze unwavering. "This man," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "has ruled this valley with fear and power. He took the man I loved, and he tried to take the husband I now love. He is a man without honor, without conscience, and he has hidden his sins behind a mask of piety for too long." The evidence was circumstantial, but it was overwhelming. The letters, the witnesses, the forgeries. They painted a picture so clear and damning that no one in the room could deny it. The judge, looking at Thorne with open contempt, declared the deed claim fraudulent and opened an official investigation into the disappearance of Samuel Carter and the attack on Eli Vance. But the true verdict was delivered by the town itself. As Thorne and his lawyers tried to leave, there was no deference, no path clearing. There was only a wall of cold, silent, accusatory stares. The power he had wielded for so long was built on a foundation of perceived respectability, and in one afternoon, Clara had demolished it. He was no longer a pillar of the community. He was a common bully and a suspected murderer. There wasn't enough hard evidence to put him in jail, not yet, but his reign was over. Within a week, Marcus Thorne and his men had packed up and left the valley, retreating to some other corner of the world. He was not brought to justice by a noose, but by the quiet, collective courage of a town that had finally been shown the truth. He was exiled not by law, but by shame. The weeks of Eli's recovery were a slow, quiet turning of a page. The land, exhausted by the drought, drank in the late-season rains and offered up a final, gentle burst of life. The air lost its oppressive, brassy heat, softening into the golden melancholy of early autumn. Inside the ranch house, an even more profound change was taking place. The silence that had once been a barrier was now a comfortable blanket, a shared space where words were often unnecessary. Clara tended to him with a quiet, unwavering devotion. She changed his bandages, cooked nourishing broths, and read to him in the long afternoons from an old book of poems she'd found on a dusty shelf. He, in turn, watched her. He watched the way the light caught in her hair as she moved about the room, the new, easy confidence in her posture, the gentle smile that now came so naturally to her lips. He was falling in love with his wife all over again, or perhaps for the very first time. The day finally came when he was strong enough to walk with the aid of crutches. His first journey was not to the barn or to the fields, but simply out onto the front porch. He stood there, leaning heavily on the wood, and breathed in the clean, crisp air of his own land. And then he saw her. She was in her garden, The small patch of earth, which she had so fiercely protected from the drought, was now thriving. Late-season squash grew heavy on the vine, and a few stubborn tomato plants still offered up their red jewels. She was on her knees, her hands in the dark, rich soil, pulling weeds with a patient, rhythmic motion. The sun, low in the western sky, cast a halo of gold around her, illuminating the loose strands of hair that had escaped her bun. Her face, turned in profile to him, was utterly, breathtakingly serene. The haunted, guarded look that had shadowed her features for so long was gone, replaced by a radiant peace that seemed to emanate from her very core. Eli felt a lump form in his throat. This was the woman who had faced down a murderer, the woman who had dragged him, bleeding, from the forest and nursed him back to life in a forgotten shack. The woman who had unlocked the darkest corners of her past and stood beside him in the face of judgment. She was not the fragile bird he had once imagined, but an oak, slender and graceful, yet strong enough to withstand any storm. He made his slow, awkward way down the porch steps and across the yard, the tips of his crutches sinking into the soft earth. She heard him coming and looked up, and the smile that broke across her face was like the sunrise. She rose, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron, and walked to meet him. They stopped in the middle of the yard, halfway between the thriving garden and the sturdy house. The setting sun bathed the entire world in a warm, honeyed light, the color of hope. There were no words to say, none that could possibly contain the vast, unspoken ocean of gratitude, sorrow, and profound love that existed between them. He let one of the crutches lean against his side and reached out, his hand open. She placed her hand in his. His was calloused and rough from a lifetime of labor. Hers was soft, yet strong, stained with the earth of the garden she had brought back to life. They just stood there, holding hands, as the great fiery ball of the sun sank below the distant, purple hills. It was a silent testament, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had survived, and a solemn, unspoken promise for everything that was to come. A few weeks later, they were married again. There was no practical arrangement this time, no contract born of necessity. This was a ceremony of pure, unadulterated choice. They didn't stand in the stuffy church with its lingering memories of confrontation. Instead, they stood in the middle of a vast, golden pasture, the late afternoon sun turning the dry grass to a sea of fire. The circuit preacher, a kind man with gentle eyes, performed the service. Their only witnesses were Jedediah Carter, who was preparing to ride west to make his own new start, and Silas, the postmaster, whose quiet courage had helped them find the truth. The ranch hands watched from a respectful distance, their hats held over their hearts. Eli, leaning on a single wooden cane now, stood tall and proud. Clara, in a simple blue dress she had made herself, with a few wildflowers tucked into her hair, had never looked more beautiful. Their vows were not flowery or poetic. They were simple, direct, and true. Like the people who spoke them, they promised honesty. They promised partnership. They promised to be a sanctuary for each other, a safe harbor in the often harsh wilderness of the world. As they spoke the words, they looked only at each other, their shared gaze a universe of its own. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Eli leaned in and kissed her, a long, tender kiss that was both a beginning and a final, peaceful end to their long, painful journey. That night, their wedding night, the house felt different. It was truly a home, filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth, in the master bedroom, which was now, finally, their bedroom. The air was soft with candlelight. The wind whispered around the corners of the house, not as a mournful cry, but as a gentle, soothing lullaby. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, watching as Clara brushed out her long hair, the candlelight turning the strands to liquid gold. She turned to him, her expression soft and open, completely free of the shadows that had once haunted her. She came and sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Eli," she began, her voice a low, intimate murmur. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently, thinking she might feel the need to speak of the past one last time. She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "I know, but I want to—" She leaned in closer, her breath warm against his ear, and whispered the words that would heal the last, lingering scar on his heart. "From now on," she said, "I will only call your name in my dreams." A slow smile spread across Eli's face, a smile of such profound, unburdened joy that it lit him from within. The ghost of Samuel Carter was finally, peacefully, at rest. The final door to the past had been closed, not slammed shut in fear, but gently locked with a key of love and acceptance. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and held her as if she were the most precious thing in all of creation. He breathed in the scent of her hair, the faint, clean smell of soap and woman, and he felt a sense of peace so deep it settled in his very bones. Outside, the wind scoured the hard, unforgiving plains, but in here, in his arms, was a gentle, sacred space. They loved each other then with a quiet, reverent passion. It was a joining that was a world away from the desperate, angry collision in the barn or the healing, tear-filled union in the cabin. This was a celebration, complete, gentle, and utterly free of pain. It was the love of two souls who had been broken apart by life and had found a way to piece themselves, and each other, back together, creating something stronger and more beautiful than what had existed before. The land outside was still a hard country, a place of drought and blizzard, of rattlesnakes and rocky soil. It was a land that demanded grit and took more than it gave. But on this night, inside a small ranch house under a vast, star-dusted sky, that same harsh land was a cradle. It was a place that had sheltered a love that had defied tragedy, overcome prejudice, and finally bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances, as resilient and beautiful as a wildflower growing in the cracks of a stone. And it was, at long last, a place of peace. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello. For more stories like this, please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with our community.